how do you keep that interest alive in things and want to keep coming to work when, of course, when it's a total shit show especially, right? But homebrewing's like that, okay? So here's the deal. I started brewing August 1st, 1997. Not to put too fine of a date on it. I keep scrupulous records, right? Very similar to what we keep now for records for the brewing here for the brewery. I mean, we've got all the records right back to our very first brew at the brewery back in 2006, right? You have to have records for the excise people on a regular basis. But as a home brewer, having those records is what I found made it easy for me to tune the process, right? Guys like Sean have got it down to an exact science for themselves where they know absolutely everything that you add in is going to add in this. Therefore, you know what the results are going to be. It makes it a little bit easier to be happier with your home brew, right? So when I started in August 1st, 1997, my very first batch of beer in my brewery was delivered by the Safeway truck, right? The Safeway truck basically dropped off my bucket and my carboy and whatever else. I bought it in Unicity, which gives you an idea as to how long ago it was, right? Unicity Safeway delivered my stuff to my apartment on Maryland. And basically I fired up a batch of Coopers with corn sugar, and I thought that this was going to be the most wonderful beer on the face of the planet. It was awful, right? There's no two ways to put it, it was awful. But the whole reason why I started brewing was because at the time, the MLCC basically had no focus whatsoever on bringing in interesting beers, right? And I had started, I didn't even drink beer until I was about 20 years old, right? And the thing for me was that as soon as I actually started to try stuff, you know, I call them what's called epiphany beers, right? The first time you taste a Pilsner or a Kel, right? You remember that. You know exactly the first time you taste a Pilsner or a Kel. Oh my God, that was so good and so soft and so sweet. And my God, what would it taste like drinking from the tanks? I still don't know, but I will eventually, right? So the first time I tasted Guinness, I know exactly where I was. I know exactly who I was with. I know the exact comment that I tasted. And I said to the guy that I was drinking it from, the fellow's name's Mike Alexander. Old punk rock guy. We were standing at the front of the West End Cultural Center, and Mike said, I said, what's that? And he, black can, and he, what the hell's that? He said, it's Guinness. And I was like, what's that? He's like, drink it. So I tried some, and I was like, tastes like wood. You know, he's screaming over top of the band. It tastes like wood. And at that time, Guinness was still doing their slight aging process in wood and doing some souring still in wood. And so Guinness had a very, very different flavor to it at that time. It was a little bit more harsh, a little bit more acrid, a little bit more bitter, and considerably more enjoyable than what I find Guinness to be these days, right? So it's from those things. I approach homebrewing from a cooking background. I cooked for a living, right? I got tired of cooking for a living. I started, you know, brewing at home. During that whole process, I stopped cooking for a living, dropped off my keys on the desk of the restaurant that I worked at, and I said, that's it, I'm out of here, right? And I started working for Willie at the Hop and Vine, right? And for 3.5 years or so when I worked for Willie at the Hop and Vine out in Charleswood, Willie basically just said, here's all the stuff, here's all the equipment, do whatever you want to do, brew beer, because we're going to drink it anyways, and go, experiment, do your thing, right? And we went from being a brew shop that didn't really have a lot of anything for ingredients. You know, we maybe had some malt extract, we had some hops, we had some grains, but then when I left there, we had, you know, 50 different kinds of grain, and very much like sort of Scotty's place is now, except everything was in little, you know, 1 pound bags, so guys could come in and just basically be like, I'll take a pound of biscuit, a pound of this, and a pound of that. You probably remember those days, Jack probably remembers those days, right? It was pretty fun, right, to be able to basically brew kind of whatever we wanted. So the trick is when I kind of took things and where I was going with my homebrew and keeping things with records, you get into these points where you're kind of like, okay, yeah, the beer's okay, and then you get an inspirational beer from somewhere else, one of these epiphany beers, and you say, oh, I'd like to brew something like that. Or, oh, I'd like to brew something smoked, or I'd like to brew Belgian beers, right? My homebrewing basically when I started was, I just want to make a really good pale ale. I couldn't even get a decent pale ale at the time, right? We could get a Marston's Pedigree Bitter, it was all right, I was okay with that, right? We could get the Marston's India Export at one point, I was okay with that. But then the MLCC started bringing in some interesting beers, and we could get Thomas Hardy's, right? And we could get Raukenfelser Stein beer, right? Which is the beer that's boiled with stones, right? And then the stones are actually saved and added into a into the bright tanks basically, and that sugar dissolves back into the beer, right, for part of the refermentation to get the carbonation. So the beer has this real minerally kind of smoky flavor to it, right? So inspirational beers that we found along the ways, and I think basically what ended up happening was I sort of found my way into Belgian beers because at the time the MLCC did not have any options for Belgian beers at all, and all of a sudden everything took off for me, right? I started reading more, right? I started basically going into the research a lot more about my beers, and my beers started turning out consistently so that I was like, shit yeah, I want to drink this whole thing, right? I do want to drink this whole thing. This is very delicious. instead of, I want to pawn this batch off on all the people that I know so I can get rid of it, right? So that happened. It took quite some time for that to happen, and for me, I went from starting my first batch of homebrew to less than 4 years I was a professional brewer. Right? So I say it happened slowly, but it happened, in the grand scheme of things, it happened very, very quickly, right? Basically in less than roughly 5 years, it was about four and a half years, I went from starting homebrew to being the head brewer at the Bushwhacker, right? So it was a very kind of short time span in the grand scheme of things. Our very first club meeting that I went to with Brian Lundeen and Willie and Don, some of the original members like Jack, and I think Sean was there as well.
6 months in.
Pardon me?
6 months in, Mike.
Yeah, you were 6 months in when you joined, but I think Jack was there at the very first club meeting at Brian Lundeen's place. But the very first club meeting that I went to, I brewed a cask of British IPA. And we didn't finish it all at the club meeting, at the very first club meeting, right? This was my first introduction to cask beer. We did it in a 3.5 gallon keg and then tilted it on its side and put a hand tap on the bottom of it so that we could tap out the keg. We didn't finish it on the first day, so what we did was we took it back to the homebrew shop, and on the afternoon at the homebrew shop, we basically polished off the rest of it, and I was drunker than a skunk when I went home. Drunker than a skunk, because we basically finished off a 3 gallon cask between myself and Willie and one other guy. Right? It was a good afternoon, let's put it that way. But that was my first experience with cask beer, right? So these things basically about keeping your passion are, number one, discovering new things. You're going to find that as you guys go through stuff, right? You're going to want to discover new beers, discover new things, right? Keep searching out new things, right? Out the new stuff. Now, that's pretty easy for some of us now because the MLCC is considerably better at their job. Most of us like to travel, right? You like to see new things when you go out and you travel, right? This also comes to the different things, of course, that I like to impress upon you guys when we start to do projects here at the brewery, right? So the supermarket sweep is a good example. Get out to the grocery store, discover new ingredients, right? Non-standard, non-traditional stuff. What can I do with these things? Can I make a purple corn beer? Can I make a, whatever? Figure it out, right? The ingredients come in part and parcel with just being creative and just doing things. But it also comes out with making those regular trips to McNally Robinson or Chapters or Amazon.com and discovering new books, right? Discovering the new techniques through the books, because the reading and the research is what's going to lead you to making things exciting for you. You're going to find that one sentence in that whole book that is, incredibly boring, like the water book, right? You're going to find that one sentence in that whole book that basically clicks for you and says, oh, I should have been doing it that way, right? Or, oh boy, that would be a great thing to try, right? And all of a sudden, your next batch of beer, you do that, and guess what? Your beer is that much better for it, right? Or you're able to relay that to other people so that other people can basically pick up on it, right? So keep out searching out new things, new books, new ingredients, right? You guys will notice that here at the brewery, we have a huge library of stuff, and I keep buying stuff. Ingredients, whatever. I spelled it wrong, right? Search out the ingredients, search out the new books. You guys will notice that basically we have a huge library of stuff here at the brewery. I don't lend out my books here at the brewery. When we get the tap room downstairs, we're probably going to find a place for the books to sit on the shelf. So if you guys come in and you want to go through what's on the shelf, the books stay here. You can come and do some research on time, probably sit and have a pint and relax and go over some of the stuff, ask a few questions if you want. The tap room's going to be very relaxed to be able to allow people to be able to do stuff like that, right? So we'll have the options for stuff like that. So the searching out new ingredients, new things, for me, the very first thing that I started working on when I was searching out new stuff was yeast, right? and I basically figured out what I wanted to do for malts. I started playing with yeast right away, right? And all the different kinds of yeast as much as we could to experience basically what the yeast company had to offer. And at the time, there was only Y yeast, right? Or we even had dry yeast in the case of Maori brew or something like that, right? But the Maori brew yeast, whatever, they're not that great, but whatever, it works, right? So at the time, that was kind of what we used. Different slurries of yeast, different orders in of yeast, different things that we could fiddle with, right? It made it interesting for stuff, different malts. It's the same deal, right? Search out those different malts. The bonus of things is now that you guys can go on the internet and go tickety tickety tick, and you have 4,000 different malts at your hand. You have 9 or 10 different yeast companies that you can go through. You have whatever. You don't always have to just make pale ale, right? It's good to perfect your recipe. That's a great thing. But then expanding things and ordering from different companies and getting things in and harassing Scott into ordering something different, or saying to me, hey, if you're ever ordering yeast from somebody different, can you get something? Yes, we can, right? It's not something I like to do on a regular basis, but we can do that, right? So the different ingredients, the different books for the different research, the different yeast, those are ways of kind of keeping things interesting for yourself, right? Then you start getting scientific about stuff. All of a sudden your books get more scientific, right? Your ingredients become a little bit more precise. You get yourself a really good scale, you get yourself a really good grinder, right? And you start really dialing in that process for yourself, right? And in that time, you'll say to yourself, I'm bored, right? I'm bored. I don't want to do the same thing again over and over and over again, right? And you kind of get bored of it. And this is what it does for me, right? I have a lot of passion about stuff very, very quickly. I fizzle out very, very quickly, right? And then it kind of comes up and it's like, yeah, okay, relax, relax, relax. Then lots more passion about stuff, very relaxed, right? Because there's times where it's like, it's not that big of a deal to me. And then there's times where it's like, oh my God, I gotta brew something, I gotta do something, I gotta get something going, something to work for, right? So in this time after when I first started out and I started discovering yeast, well then all of a sudden I discovered, 10 different Belgian yeasts. Well shit, there's 10 different Belgian yeasts and I can brew 30 different kinds of Belgian beer, and I can go buy Michael Jackson's World of Belgian Beers and I can start brewing these beers at home, right? So start brewing these beers at home, start brewing the beers over at the Hop and Vine as well. I think there was one Christmas where for all of our homebrew customers, I gave out essentially a Trinity series of beers, 3 different Belgian beers, bottled in Heidelberg bottles. It was awesome, right? The old Heidelberg bottles with the little keg look to the bottom of them. And all of our homebrew customers basically went home with a set of 3 beers. And I did a Belgian double, I did a Belgian wit, and I also did a Belgian, I think it was a triple of some sort, or a blonde ale of some sort, if I remember correctly, right? So it was kind of fun, basically, to get all these beers ready, and if you guys have noticed, I carried that through into the brewery here, right? And it's something that we carried through. It's not the same recipes that we use, but it was a similar idea of, hey, can I have 3 different beers ready all at once so you could sit down in the night and sit there and drink 3 different beers, right? So at the same time, there was a fellow locally who had moved here from California, Brett Nickel. And Brett Nickel was the founding editor of the Celebrated Beer News. Is everybody familiar with Celebrated Beer News? It's the beer paper in California that is at every pub, right? He was the founding publisher and he teaches, I believe, native studies over at the University of Manitoba now, right? And Brett and his buddy David Hentelef, everybody knows Hentelef Park in the South End, right? That's his dad. David started up a newspaper here in Winnipeg called Brew North, right? And Brew North was an early kind of attempt to try and get people a little bit more focused on craft beer. So I started doing some writing for Brew North, giving some homebrew recipes. If you guys go through find the old back issues, find the homebrew recipes, you guys will be able to find roughly the recipe for Scrapper. It's out there, right? Roughly, right? And basically started doing things like being a little bit more involved in the homebrew community and being a little bit more involved in being out there and trying to teach people what to do and how to kind of come to it at a different angle, right? So I did a couple articles for them, one about a properly poured pint, how important it is to have a bartender who knows what the hell they're doing, and one about recipes, one about growing hops early that they published in the Prairie Gardener as well. I think it was in 2000 and I'm trying to remember now, No, it would have been in 1999, I think they published it in the Prairie Garden, right? So grew some hops, right? All of a sudden I started thinking to myself, well shit, if we can get all these ingredients, now let's try and grow our own ingredients too, right? So what we did was we brought in hops from the guys at Fresh Hops down in the States, right? Brought in, some of the guys are still working with that same stock of hops that we brought in, right? Brought in the hops, 2 per mound for everybody, and said, here you go, give it a try. And some of the guys that grow are still growing. Sean's nodding his head, right? Guys like Don Kerr, who's an old member of the club, he put them against the side of his garage, and one year he had a half a bucket of 5-gallon bucket of hops. The second year he had 2 5-gallon buckets of hops, and the third year he had 2 garbage cans. 2 great big garbage cans of Cascade hops, right? He's like, what am I going to do with all these hops? And I was like, brew! You know? So it's kind of a funny thing, the way that it worked like that. And that was good because I basically got a good chance to see, you know, how do hops grow? How do you get them to grow properly I was growing them on a balcony, like in an apartment, you know, in little pails, right? And it worked. It worked. It worked. We had a tasting at my house then with Brian and a few of the other people. Some of the guys from the brew club, and basically what ended up happening is people brought some vintage dated beers to the tasting, and all of a sudden I got inspiration from, oh shit, we've got, you know, all these different, you know, vintage dated beers. These are fantastic. You know, we had a 10-year-old bottle of Sammy Claus that Brian had brought with him that was unbelievable, and I thought to myself, oh boy, if we could make some strong beers, if I could make some strong beers and put them down and forget about them, it'd be great, right? So things led to the point where I got to myself of turning around and giving myself some education, right? I thought to myself, I'm taking these technical manuals to bed, and I'm taking these technical manuals to bed for light reading. It's about time that I took this and went pro, right? So I did a little bit of research, found the American Brewers Guild, which is who I went through for my brewing stuff. And while I was working at the Hop and Vine, I basically worked on my education stuff through the American Brewers Guild. And when I finished, I left for a little bit to go do the schooling, came back, and then started farming my resume out across the country, right? And I got 11 responses, only 2 positives, right? And 1 job offer just before I had decided to pick up and move to BC. Right? So job offer from Agassiz at the time. Don Harms phoned me up and said, do you want to work on the bottling line? I was like, I got a chance to go brew, I'm going to go brew. Right? So I picked up and moved to brewing. Now here's the thing about education and home brewing, and brewing in general. This never stops. Right? That never stops. And I'll tell you right now, I probably know less than I did then. Less now than I knew then. Right? But at the time, basically it was like, okay, I need to go get this education. Most of the brewers in Canada at the time there was no brewing programs at all. There was no Niagara, there was no Olds, there was no Kwantlen Polytechnic College, right? This is where I decided that the jumping off point was, I want to go pro, right? So I got my education, went down to the American Brewers Guild, did some brewing on site in California, but most of the course is actually done here from home, right? And then you go down and you go finish your brewing stuff up with your lab work, your tastings, your whatever else you're going to do down in California. Now they work out of Vermont, from the guy's brewery in Vermont. But either way, they do a summer session, I think, in California and a winter session in Vermont, which is kind of opposite to what they should do, but whatever. Right? So, pardon me?
Go skiing.
Go skiing, yeah, exactly, right? Now, if anybody here knows about Vermont, you know that the beers are pretty damn good in Vermont, right? Vermont had Greg Noonan as a good inspiration for a start. Everybody's familiar with Brewing Lager Beer, the book. He had the 7-Barrel Brewery. Right? He had a book called the 7-Barrel Brewery Handbook, which I didn't realize, but Greg had named a double IPA in his book, Cumulus Ludicrous. I didn't realize that. So we're on the same wavelength, right? So I got my education in brewing from the American Brewers Guild, and I decided, okay, I'm going to take this and I'm going to farm out my resume and see what happens. And I got a job offer from a guy at Backwoods Brewing Company in BC, which is now Dead Frog. Okay. And I worked for Dead Frog for a little while, very short time, before I got a phone call, hey David, do you want to be the head brewer at the Bushwhacker? Right? So, who's crazy? right? So, hey David, do you want to be the brewer at the Bushwhacker? And I actually received that job offer before I went to BC, but they decided to keep the brewer that they had on contract. They decided to keep him around for another 6 months or so before they had enough of him, right? And the previous brewer at the Bushwhacker before me was quite the inebriate, and he now works at, I think, what's it called? What's the other pub in Regina? The other with the set of 4. Anyways, whatever. He works at one of the other pubs now. But basically, he's a genius homebrewer, right? Absolute genius homebrewer, but an absolute drunk. So it was one of those things where it was very tough to keep up with the guy, right? So when I went to the Bushwhacker, I basically treated it as, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to learn. I'm going to be the head brewer. Yay, I'm the head brewer of the Bushwhacker. We've been drinking Bushwhacker beer for about 4 years before that, and I was really like proud of like, okay, I'm going to be the head brewer at this place within that 4.5-year time span of me starting actually doing it. But as soon as I got there, I realized that the guys at the Ales Club had their BJCP program, right? And I got involved with the BJCP program. I got involved with the Ales Club, right? And basically took it as, I'm going to learn some more stuff from these guys as well too. I got my BJCP designation. It took us a year to do the program. And once I had the BJCP, Beer Judge Certification Program stuff, the points that I was gathering from judging beer at competitions were automatically applied to my account. And I've been gathering those points for judging ever since then, right? So I think we've done something like, I can't remember how many it is now, but it's in that roughly 10-year span. I've done lots and lots of competitions and gathered lots and lots of judging points over that time. And the BJCP is one of the things that impresses upon you, just as they did at school, that the learning is never done, right? So updating to the new BJCP program is also going to give you a good baseline for styles, knowledge for flavors, knowledge for ingredients, knowledge for everything that goes into brewing, so that you can pass that on to your fellow brewers and hopefully keep the passion alive for brewing as well, right? So they've recently updated the BJCP stuff, and with all the infighting and shenanigans that's been going on at the BJCP in the last little while, I kind of said to myself, well, I'm not going to worry too much about upgrading. I think I'm at the point where I've got the decision that, yeah, okay, I better upgrade and get onto the next set of stuff, because I'm going to be judging with people that are, you know, that are like way more advanced than what I know about the new styles. Like, what do I know about Kentucky Common at this point? I have no idea. I just know that it's got corn, right? So, yip-de-doo, right? So, keeping up with the BJCP stuff is something that's going to force you to rehash your education stuff about every 4 to 8 years, depending on how long it takes them to come out with a new style guideline, right? You're going to keep up with that stuff, keep rolling with it, and keep doing stuff. Therefore, there's more books, more ingredients, more everything that you can know about, and pass that on for people, right? One of the things that I found that basically was the penultimate, basically the thing that brought me back to homebrewing and wanted to be a pro brewer was the discovery of sour beers, right? And the discovery of, holy smokes, I know all this stuff about beer, now I need to forget everything that I've learned and start brewing sour beers and trying to do this, right? So the brewing of sour beers that I found was one of the very last things I did as homebrewer. I still have 1 bottle left from my homebrew days of my last bottle of homebrew, right? I think Nathan's had it before. I don't know if you've had it before.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, so, but basic gist of it is discovering sour beers is the very last thing that I did as a homebrewer. Was like, oh, there's a whole world out there that I don't know about.
The Central City Sour Brown is actually really...
The Central City Sour Brown is in now as well.
Yeah, we tried it yesterday.
And the St. Louis Foods.
Yeah, but the St. Louis and some of those are all basically sweetened, right?
Yeah.
So the trick is if as soon as you have something like a Cantillon or one of the ones that's like a true sour beer, you realize that everything that you've tasted up to that point is wrong, right? It's one of those things where you kind of say to yourself, okay, how do I do that? And how do I brew that at home? How do I go ahead and do this, right? So it's a good thing. And that's one of those things to me that always just kind of opens up new things. If you're not a fan of sour beer now, I'll tell you right now, probably 3 to 4 years from now, you will be, right? But it's going to take some time to build that palate. But at the same time, as soon as you start discovering those sours, it keeps the passion alive for, okay, now I want to make some more homebrew sized test batches of that. Now I want to start with 1 or 2 barrels. Then all of a sudden I want to start with 16 barrels. And then all of a sudden, well, this is my hobby taken way too far anyways, so holy smokes, let's see how it's going to go when we start doing like large volumes of sour beer all at once, right? And that to me is something that just kind of keeps it alive now that I'm actually brewing as well, like that I'm doing more CEO type stuff here at the brewery, right? More of the book work and more of the planning and things like that here at the brewery, right? It still makes it interesting for me to be like, oh, I had that beer, gotta go brew, right? So, basically, are there things that you guys find yourselves that you find that kind of wane, and then what is it that you discovered that said to yourself, oh shit, I need to do this for my beer? Anybody? Brian?
Quite a bit.
What's that?
Quite a bit myself.
What's a good example?
Well, we'll talk about that, some finding stuff
Okay.
in a bit, because, you know, like Dave's talking about with all this, you're constantly learning stuff. I've been brewing for about 10 years now and still learning stuff, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, for me anyway.
Still keeps it exciting,
Yeah.
right? I mean, we learn as much from our mistakes as we learn from the stuff that we do well.
If you take good notes.
Yeah, if you take good notes, you learn just as much from your mistakes as you learn from the stuff you do well, and that's a good thing to know, right? Like, don't think that we don't make mistakes when you're starting to talk about 4,000 liter batches, right? So it's part of the reason why we built the lab here at the brewery, right? You've got to have mistakes to know what you're doing and to know where you've screwed up and to know exactly what's happened to something so that you don't repeat it, right?
Mhm.
So, anybody else have anything they want to chime in with how they kept it interesting for themselves?
I know a huge thing for me was I started brewing smaller batches, so you could take it way off in one direction and not get stuck with 20 liters. Like just doing like little 8-liter batches on a Tuesday night, like really freed up my inhibition, like my hesitation, you know, to really commit. So.
Did you find that you were hesitant? I know we talked about this a little bit before. Did you find that you were super hesitant to try something new simply because you were going to end up with 5 gallons of it?
Absolutely.
So therefore you brew smaller batches,
Yeah.
right? So that's something that I did myself when I started doing some really strong beers at the homebrew shop. And I said to myself, okay, I don't need 23 liters of barley wine. It would be nice to be able to age that barley wine. But seriously, when I moved to BC, I took almost 20 cases of beer with me. Simply because, right? It was like, what's the point, right? Like, what's the point in having all these beers in the cellar all that time? It would have been smarter for me to do, I was doing half batches, but I still only had like, I would have had like 2 cases or whatever of beer from that half batch. It was still 2 cases too many. You know, I needed maybe 6 bottles. You know, some of the guys, I think in the River City group, you guys do beer exchange as well, right?
Yeah.
So that's something that's always interesting that I found that you guys do that is basically, you know, come to the beer exchange with X amount of bottles and trade beers so you guys get a chance to try a bunch of different home brews and have an idea as to the recipes and stuff like that, right? So, you know, to me that seems like an excellent idea for keeping it interesting because you get to try a lot of different home brew all at once, right? Without having to break the bank for a batch of beer, right? Anybody else have any comments towards stuff?
Well, just
Tim?
I'm kind of new to brewing, so I mean everything's pretty exciting for me, but I think that one of the things that's keeping it really exciting is the fact that I can create something that maybe I think would be interesting to try, like you said. And part of what's really helping a lot is having the opportunity to go and brew with other people, and I would hope to be able to do that more, because as I said, I'm a inexperienced brewer, so when you go and brew with the more experienced brewers and see kind of what they do and their thought process, that really helps you expand your own, and it's you know, bringing me into those next levels of you know, recipe development now rather than just finding a recipe online, right?
Mhm.
Those types of things. So.
Yeah, it makes it exciting for things. That's part of the reason why Big Brew Day exists, right? It's like, here, come see that, you know, if this idiot can build a brewery and go ahead and do stuff, you guys could come and brew on it and it would be familiar, right? And then therefore you could take whatever you learn here. If there's, I think it's just everyday stuff that we do here, and sometimes somebody goes, oh, I never thought about that, right? Well, all of a sudden it becomes, great, you learned something, that's great. Your time here was worth it, never mind the fact that you get word out of it, right? So, you know, the time is definitely worth it. Somebody else had something else here? Yeah?
I was gonna say kegging and just like the idea of reducing the time involved in like the work part of it, right? Anything you can do to simplify, and like if you look at the Brewlosophy guy and like all the like, hey, if I can simplify this and still get really good beer, then that's more time just brewing and like playing with a recipe and playing with other stuff as opposed to doing the work part.
Yeah, my excitement for kegging beer was when I did my first keg beer, and the guy that I was working with there, Willie, came up and he had a Pepsi machine,
Yeah.
and we realized that we could hook the beer through the Pepsi machine, right? And it was like, oh wait, we can have 5 beers on tap? He's like, yes. I was like, done, you know? So, and basically everything's sediment free, right? If you didn't want the sediment. And at the time, I think that was really important to me, maybe not so much, you know, during the later stages of my home brewing, because I focused a lot on doing Belgians, but yeah, it was something that I was like, yeah, okay, good, we can have clear beer and just go to the tap and have whatever we want, whenever we want, right? So, kind of a neat way of doing it, very, very neat way of doing it.
Well, also, and for doing something like a barley wine, it's really nice to be able to have this much on a night. And, so like, do I want 650 milliliters of barley wine on a Tuesday?
Exactly, exactly. So, anything else?
Yeah, one thing, a motivator for anything that's going to be work is that you have the opportunity to share with other homebrewers. So
Yeah.
there's a whole bunch of hops out there, I don't know them, and so next year I'm just going to have to get a tub of syrup, just do an extract and do 1 gallon of each hop, dry hopped in, so I can learn what these new hops are like.
Yeah, that's,
Same thing, motivation to do a split batch, like group separation split batch. The fact that at the end of all this, it's not just for you. You can bring these and show them to other people and say, this is the difference. You can taste it for yourself. And that really motivates you to do the things that take the effort, to juggle the extra carboys or do something weird and time-consuming in your basement.
every single year we get offered roughly 15 different hop varieties that are new varieties that only have a number associated with them. And then the next year that number becomes a name. If it was popular in the test cycle, all of a sudden we've got a name to that hop. And so you get these hops ahead of time, you know, Azaka and Lemon Drop and some of these other ones that have become brand new, that you need to basically all of a sudden put an association, a name to the number. And, you know, we can get test samples of that stuff ahead of time, but sometimes you forget, oh yeah, I gotta actually figure out what that number correlates to what they've called it now, and all of a sudden it's a rare hop and you can't get it anymore.
Yeah.
Right? So that's how Mosaic went, that's how Amarillo went, that's how Lemon Drop has been, that's how Citra was for a long time. And the funny thing is as the homebrewers catch on to it and start brewing Citra beers and Mosaic beers and all of a sudden all that stuff, well that translates into pro brewing, and guess what? We can't get any of those.
Yeah. Mount
Right?
Rainier. And this stuff goes out of fashion. Mount Rainier's sort of for making pilsners, and everybody's doing
Exactly.
IPAs this year, so you can't get Mount Rainier.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very weird.
Sorry to cut
We
you
have to
off.
move
I'm
on?
gonna take this next group. Whoever's in the research group.
I was gonna say one thing that I really like is brewing with other people. Like
Yeah.
Gilles and I get together now and then, and we're like, "What are you interested in making?" And you know, we do a bunch of research. We talk about recipes, get together. We usually make a big beer of some kind, big Belgian, a quad, or whatever. And then you know, you don't have to drink it all. You split it, and then you can kind of lay them down and come back to them later and say, "Oh, how did that develop? What happened 8 months later with this quad that we had? We did that Bière de Garde that we did, like what happens to it 10 months later? Oh, it's not so great anymore." You know?
It really wasn't
It
so
was,
great
it was
anymore.
really great at 6 months, not so great at a year. But
Yeah. I was gonna say it's interesting too because I've been brewing with Rob for a year and change now. I've never actually seen anybody else brew beer. Like, I've just never brewed with anybody else. But coming to the club, like trying all of your guys' beers, like, oh man, how do I make that? So you go back and you try to change what you did and you mess around with the water and whatever else you can do to try to like duplicate some of what the more experienced brewers like Sean and like all the rest of you guys do. It's pretty interesting actually. So it kind of keeps you motivated to try new things and stuff like that. So.
It's part of the reason why I like so much when like Ralph is always like, okay, we're brewing this weekend. If anybody wants to come out and see what we're doing,
Yeah.
we're brewing this weekend. He's licked all of his infection issues, so it's a good time to go actually go hang out with him. It was all down to his counterflow chiller, if you guys remember. It was pretty funny, but it drove him nuts for like 10 batches of beer.
Oh, no.
Just constantly infected beer. But the thing is that Ralph has always been very open with, come see how it's done like 250 liters at a time. You know,
Yeah.
and it's quite an incredible thing to actually see, okay, how do you deal with the bulk of 250 liters? And you think it's a lot. It's not really, but it is a lot of work, right? So it's the same as here when we're like, oh yeah, let's do a double, 40 or 50 liter batch. Holy shit, that's a lot from a homebrew standpoint. That is a lot of beer that you've got to muscle around the grain with and work with, right? So all the way up to, okay, let's do 1,000 liters worth of beer. That is really a lot, right? And then, you guys are going to be doing more, the guys from Torque are going to be doing more, all that stuff. It's going to be quite interesting to see when the new breweries get open, right? So just sort of as a parting thought, what I find is that all the things that help me keep the passion about the home brewing seem to transfer into everything else I do in life, right? And that's a good thing. It's a good skill set to learn, because all of a sudden I know more about baking bread, and I'm a little bit more on top of keeping my sourdough cultures. I'm just starting to learn about cheese, right, and how to make cheese. There used to be a fellow here in the club, Steve Moran, you know, God rest his soul, whatever. Steve made fantastic cheeses, fantastic bread. Grew trout in his backyard, you know, in a 10-gallon, two 55-gallon drums sunk into his backyard until his wife kicked him out. He didn't have his trout anymore, right? So Steve was a great homebrew guy, right? And he worked at the LC and was instrumental in getting a lot of these new Canadian micros into the LC before he died. But basically, the club members that have been through the club, that have come to the club, done things, they've died, they've passed on, they've left on. We're still left with a lot of that knowledge, right? So Ken Stewart and his wild rice beers, and Steve and his fantastic grappa, right? Steve made a wicked distilled grappa that was burn your ass off, basically, but it was good stuff, right? So this kind of stuff kind of transfers into the other things that I do in life, simply just because now all of a sudden I'm more interested in the process, right? Lately I've been interested in the process of distilling, so it makes me interested in how does it work, what's going to work, how do you do the mashes, how do you do this stuff, how do you do that stuff, can it be done, right? And it brings me back to the idea of when I first started homebrewing, can I make something better than what I can buy at the store, right? And the answer is, especially from a homebrew side of things, yes, because you can afford to put in 15 kilograms of some rare grain that you can only buy from one supplier, just to make that one medal-winning beer that, you know, is great on a commercial level. We can't do stuff like that, right? It doesn't make sense to do stuff like that, right? Because you'd be losing money hand over fist, right? So it makes it interesting for doing other things. I don't know if you guys have found that at all, as to how it transfers into the other things you do in your life, but it's a really good thing to keep things up. If there are no other questions, I don't want to go on further, but the basic gist of it is like, keep it alive, keep it going. Make it interesting for yourselves. Part of what today is all about, right? Okay? No other questions? All right, that's it. Let's drink coffee. All right, thanks guys.